Hey everybody, Steve Matthews here. This is episode number 6, Bitcoin versus the regulatory state. I want you to take a look at a few headlines here with me before we dive into today's topic. I just want to go through a few of these with you. And tell me this, see if you can spot a common pattern here. I don't think it's probably going to be too awfully difficult for you. Let's take a look. These are all actually some headlines that I've taken from pretty mainstream sources. This first one here is from CNBC. Now, this one was actually a couple months back. It was October 23rd, 2017. Let's take a look at the headline here. Prince Awalid says Bitcoin will implode. Enron in the making. And why does he say that? Well, it gives us a bullet point here. And it says, it just doesn't make sense. This thing, he's talking about Bitcoin, he says, this thing is not regulated. It's not under control. It's not under the supervision of any central bank. So he's very upset about that, and he thinks it's going to be the next Enron. Now, maybe for some of you who aren't familiar with Enron, what is Enron? Well, Enron was a company. It was an energy company located in Houston, Texas. I don't think they're in business anymore. Maybe I'm wrong about that. I haven't followed them for a long time. But back in the early 2000s, there was a great big scandal. It was an accounting scandal. They were committing fraud on a huge basis. Their stock was something in the range of $50 a share or something like this. And it quickly went down to zero or very close to zero when it was discovered that they had been engaged in years of accounting fraud. And this prince, this Awali, thinks that Bitcoin is going to kind of be the next Enron. It's going to be the next giant fraud because it's not regulated, it's not under control, it's not under the supervision of a central bank. Those are the three reasons he gives here. Let's go on to our second example. Now, this is another one from a mainstream source here. This is the Washington Post. And you can see the headline, Bitcoin's boom is a boon for extremist groups. And it's got this Richard Spencer chap on here who's, I guess he's kind of a white nationalist kind of a fellow. And you read through this, basically, you come away with this impression that the only people who would use Bitcoin are criminals and political extremists and racists and a kind of a motley crew, the sort of people you don't want to be around. That's kind of the message here in the Washington Post. But even beyond that, they talk here about regulation. And let's see, I'm not seeing that. Where is that? Here we go. It's talking about comparing Bitcoin to other financial instruments, maybe more traditional financial instruments. And I'll just start reading here. This is a paragraph that says, a secure, continuously updated ledger called a blockchain records all transactions in a publicly visible way, assigning each an alphanumeric record. Unlike the closely government-regulated banking systems that record traditional financial transactions, the blockchain is completely decentralized, relying on a complex mathematical calculations across countless computers worldwide. Such a system makes it difficult for regulators and law enforcement agencies to monitor assets or to know the identities of particular account holders. So, again, we have a problem here, according to the Washington Post, that Bitcoin is unregulated, and there's a whole lot of unregulated trading going on out there, and they're not happy about it, Dean. Oh, and by the way, the article there in the Washington Post that I cited, that's also from December 26th. So there's a second article here. Washington Post was December 26th. Another one in CNBC on December the 27th. It has a headline, Bitcoin is a dicey investment. Why one veteran gold analyst predicts it could burn a lot of investors. And maybe that veteran gold analyst is right. I'm not here. The purpose of this video is not to defend or to attack Bitcoin, but I do want to illustrate a point. I'm going to get to that in just a moment here. But let's take a look at one thing that this fellow says. Or I should say the article. And here's the kind of the money paragraph. But a lot of work still needs to be done on the regulatory front, contended Dudas. He sees this as a big catalyst for sustainable downside risks. So what he's saying here that unless the regulators come in and start regulating, doing their regulatory thing, that Bitcoin, it could very well plunge, and it could plunge because of the lack of regulation. And then the final example here that I wanted to bring to you. Again, this is a very recent headline. It's actually was updated on Christmas Day, December 25th. And here's what the gentlemen at the Wall Street Journal have to say about it. They asked this question: who regulates Bitcoin trading? Well, the answer is no U.S. agency has jurisdiction. Futures regulators at the CFTC, that's the Commodities Futures Trading Commission, that's what that means, CFTC, recently sounded an alarm on leverage trading on unregulated exchanges, while the SEC cracks down on ICOs. An ICO is an initial coin offering. That's something that's kind of cryptocurrency speaks, and we won't get too far into that here today, because again, my main point really isn't to talk about Bitcoin, but it's to talk about a particular approach to actually criminal justice. Kind of interesting. The main trend that you see in all four of these stories is what? Lack of regulation is a problem. And the government needs to step in and get a handle on things, because it's all out of control right now. There's no central bank. There's no regulatory agency with jurisdiction. It's time to lasso this thing and rein it in before it kills us all. Apparently. I was having dinner the other day with my family, and it was kind of interesting. My mom brought this point up as I was talking about the whole regulatory issue, and she asked this question. She said, "Well, why does everything have to be regulated?" That's a really good question that she brought up, by the way. Mom doesn't trust her judgment when we talk about politics a lot of times. A lot of times she doesn't have the confidence that she knows what she's talking about, but she has a much, much better sense of right and wrong than I think that she realizes. That's a great question she brought up. Why does everything have to be regulated? Well, I guess the short answer to that question is, well, it doesn't have to be regulated. But because of certain unbiblical assumptions that are held by the people who run the United States and really run pretty much every other country in the West, and probably every other country in the world, we have what's called a regulatory state in the United States now, and it's built on a particular approach to criminal justice. And by the way, just to let you know here, before I talk about this approach to criminal justice, there are two basic approaches to criminal justice. There's crime prevention and crime punishment. And before I get too far into that conversation, I just want to give credit where credit's due. I'm actually stealing this stuff from John Robbins. He made this point, and I can't remember which lecture it's in. I think it's in one of his lectures on the Trinity Foundation website on government, or I think it's I think it's maybe in one of his series on philosophy, where he talks about political philosophy. I don't have the immediate reference here, but I remember him distinctly talking about this. It made a big impression on me. And the point that he made is that there are two basic approaches to criminal justice. There's crime prevention and there's crime punishment. Crime prevention is what the regulatory state's all about. Crime punishment is the biblical approach. Let's break those down a little bit. For crime prevention, what that means is you have to punish everybody in the hopes of preventing a future crime. So in order to make the regulatory state happen, you have to have a giant bureaucracy. And of course, that's what we have here in the United States. And of course, the United States is not alone, but we certainly have that here in the United States. But the same is true in any other Western nation. If this giant regulatory bureaucracy, and they've got thousands and thousands and thousands of pages in the federal code, and it grows by thousands and thousands and thousands of pages every year, it gets more complex all the time. And the whole idea is to prevent a crime. We say, how many times have you heard people say, well, when such and such a bad thing happens, some politician will stand up and say, there ought to be a law to ensure that this never happens again. This kind of thing. That's the regulatory state. I can just give you an example of this in my own life. I have a commercial driver's license. I haven't driven for over 20 years, but I have a commercial driver's license and I have a hazmat license with that. Well, you probably remember way back in the day, there was this fellow named Tim McVeigh, and he blew up the federal office building in Oklahoma City. And ever since that time, anybody who has a commercial driver's license always has to go submit fingerprints and a background check to the Transportation Safety, the TSA, the agency that regulates transportation. And it costs about, I don't know, was it $80 or $100 to have this background check done. So every time I go to renew my license, I get dinged for, I don't know, 80 to $100. In other words, I'm punished by the state because what they're trying to do is they're trying to prevent crime. They're trying to check to see, do I have a criminal background? So it can become very burdensome. That's a pretty minor thing. You can say, well, that's not that big a deal. Well, you're right. It's not that big of a deal. But I'm still being punished, even though I haven't done anything wrong, because the idea is they want to prevent crime. Biblical criminal justice is all about punishing evildoers. Think about, and we talked about this, I think, on a different video fairly recently. What's the job of the state? The job of the civil magistrate is to punish evildoers. That's one of the two jobs that a civil magistrate has, is to punish evildoers. He doesn't punish everybody in the hopes of preventing crime. He punishes those who've actually done evil, who are actually guilty of doing something wrong. That's biblical criminal justice. You have a much smaller state because you don't need all these big regulatory agencies, right? You don't punish someone unless he actually does something wrong. Now, how does that apply to money? Well, it's simply this, that the free market is the very best regulator of all. So instead of having to have this huge army of regulators, the SEC, the Federal Reserve, and all of these other groups that oversee the financial system, their job is there really to try to prevent crime. But instead of trying to prevent crime, why don't we just punish those people who actually do evil? That's the biblical process. That's the biblical model, to punish evildoers. So all of these people who object to Bitcoin because it's not regulated by a central bank, it's not under any supervision, that no agency has jurisdiction over it, they're thinking from a statist model. They're not thinking from a biblical limited government model. As Christians, we favor crime punishment, not crime prevention. That's all for this week. Thanks for watching. This is Steve Matthews, and I probably won't see you until after the first of the year, so I'd like to wish you and your family a very happy new year. We'll talk to you next week.